Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. On this episode of the podcast, we wanted to share a lecture from History Professor Emeritus, Dr. Richard Grace. This was the first in a series of lectures on campus to provide historical context to Russia's current invasion of Ukraine. It is titled, Refugees, the Humanitarian Crisis After World War II and Similar Crises Since Then.
The term. This is the term that I got from the OED. A refugee is a person who has been forced to leave his or her home and seek refuge elsewhere, especially in a foreign country, from war, religious persecution, political troubles, the effects of a natural disaster, etc., a displaced person. Let's look at a second definition, which is significantly different from this. In 1951, the United Nations created this. It was about the same time that the UN was creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this says refugees are persons who are outside their country of origin. So immediately you want to think, does that mean that people who left Kharkiv and went to Lviv are not refugees? Because they don't conform to this definition. For reasons of feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order and, as a result, require international protection. So there are similar definitions, but actually with that requirement of foreign refuge, taking up refuge outside the country of origin, that's a significant difference. So the question is, first of all, who's a refugee? And I want to look at some examples that are far different from what we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks. Are these people refugees? What do you think? It looks like these people are simply following these people where they're headed. We're not told, but they're trying to escape from the consequences of that terrible hurricane that hit New Orleans about 17 years ago. How about this guy? It's like somebody you see at the end of Admiral Street, Admiral and Charles, with a sign that say he doesn't have a home. And does that make him a refugee? What's he in refuge from? What's he seeking refuge from? He might have been born a mile away from where he's set up on the corner seeking some help, but he doesn't have a roof, he doesn't have a bed, he doesn't know where his next meal is coming from. And some people in society might say, well, it's his own fault. And you may even agree with that it is his own fault. But it could be that he was living with roommates and they threw him out. There are lots of reasons why he might be homeless and penniless. He is, after all, a creature of God. So, another issue here. How far do you extend what the meaning of refugee is? How about these people? Would you call them refugees? Now, it says prisoners. The photograph that I found said prisoners. They were in a prison somewhere, I think in Arkansas, or maybe Texas. But you might think, these guys got in a fight. This is after one of the Indian Wars, as various Plains Indians tribes were resisting the push of white settlers westward, pushing them off their land, killing their buffaloes, putting them in reservations. But do these people belong in a prison? These are children. And the wives of these fellows who may have been warriors, but does that make them refugees? They are, after all, displaced. They have been pushed away from their traditional homes. So there are lots of questions here about how people become refugees. And once they are refugees, where do they go? How do they get along with life once they've been expelled from the place that they were used to living in? So let's look at one more question before we get into World War II. What's the difference between a migrant and a refugee? Do you think one term is more sympathetic than the other? You think refugee has a softer meaning or a more sympathetic meaning than migrant does? How about this woman? I took this distinction out of the online Britannica encyclopedia. Simply speaking, a migrant is someone who chooses to move, and a refugee is someone who has been forced from their home. Well, what do you suppose the case with this woman is? Is she a migrant because she chose to leave Honduras? Or is she a refugee because the violence in her homeland was too threatening to her children? So she thought that she'd be better off if she could get them to America, not anticipating that she'd be hit with tear gas once she got here. So how do you apply that distinction at the top to this woman? Lots of questions that are kind of hard to answer. So we've gotten to World War II. All kinds of refugees for all kinds of reasons. When the war was over, pogroms continued in Poland. And this picture on the upper left, I do have a pointer somewhere here. This picture on the upper left shows children leaving Poland because of the pogrom that was happening in 1946. So the anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe remains very strong in Poland and Slovakia when the war was over, and we tend to think, well, the Holocaust has been settled, it's all done, but it wasn't. So they're on the move again. These are Japanese prisoners of war, and the UN declaration and the UN administration to take care of displaced persons didn't include prisoners of war. So there were about 3.5 million Japanese prisoners of war who had no place to go if they couldn't get back to Japan immediately once the war was over. And as I'll show you in another picture, many of them wound up going to Russia as forced laborers. These are women, in all likelihood Jewish, in a displaced persons camp. I say in all likelihood Jewish because they seem to have a binding quality, even though they're living in extreme circumstances. And we'll talk about the Zionist movement to bring people together and move them to a new place in just a few minutes. These are people leaving East Germany because they're so fearful of the Red Army advancing. And so they're trying to get to the west, and as you can see, their resources are slight. Look at that wagon, everything that's on it, and maybe a couple of simple suitcases, and not much else other than the clothes on their back. These are people, mostly women, but not entirely, in Poland, who are being shipped eastward as slave labor into the Soviet Union once the war is over. And so you see all these different kinds of circumstances for refugees once the fighting had stopped. Let's look at a few ships. This is the St. Louis, which sailed from Europe with 917 passengers, hoping that they could get into Cuba. Once they got to Cuba, they were denied entry. They didn't have any documents. They were like stateless people. They didn't have visas, passports, labor permits, and so Cuba turned them away. But they didn't sail back to Europe right away. They sailed to Florida. They could see the lights of Miami, but the U.S. State Department wouldn't admit them. And the reason for that, in all likelihood, is because a high-ranking member of the State Department was a determined anti-Semite. So the St. Louis went home, and of the 917 who were on board, about 25% died in the camps. The war began for Britain on September 1st, 1939, and they had a plan to send children overseas to the Dominions because they expected a fierce fight right away. This is 3 weeks into the war, September 17th, when a German U-boat, which had already just a short while previously sunk another vessel, torpedoed this passenger ship. That was against German protocol. The German military were against sinking passenger ships, but apparently this U-boat captain was trigger happy, and 87 of the children were killed and 175 adults. Some of them were rescued, as you can see here, these people getting into a lifeboat. But the plan that the Children's Overseas Reception Board had set up just before the war began to evacuate children to the Dominions, this ship was going to Canada, they quit on. And actually what happened shortly after this, Warsaw fell not long after this, and the fighting in the West didn't happen. Nothing was happening in West, well, a few little skirmishes, but not anything of significance. And so we have a period that's called the Phony War. And in the course of that phony war, the British tend to give up on some of their evacuation plans. We'll look at a slide to that effect in just a moment. But while we're staying with ships, I want to look at the Gustav. Once again, we have to think about the terror among German civilians as the Red Army came west. If you think what the Red Army is doing, what the Soviet, let's just say the Russian Army is doing in Ukraine is terrible now, it's hardly anything. And I don't want to diminish what is happening in Ukraine, but they were barbaric on an Olympian scale when they came into East Germany in 1945. And so people are terrified. These people from East Prussia, by the thousands, jam onto this passenger liner, which was never a German military ship, unless you consider a cadet training ship to be a military vessel. But they get out into the Baltic Sea, and the Russian submarine sees the lights on the ship and torpedoes it immediately. 3 torpedoes hit this, so it didn't have a chance. The Baltic, you can see the date here, the Baltic Sea was freezing. Probably as many people died from hypothermia as died from drowning. This is the worst maritime disaster in human history. So, let's look at other evacuation efforts. Here's the plan that the British had in place when the war began. First day, 1st September, 1939, they're going to load women and children on trains and send them out into the English countryside. They had it so well planned that they evacuated 1.5 million people in the first 3 days of the war. Except Britain didn't go to war. I mean, there was no real fighting through the winter of 1939, 1940, except for the Finns, who were giving the Russian army a terribly bloody nose at that point in time. But things don't get really violent until the spring of 1940. And at that point, in May of 1940, when Hitler begins the Blitzkrieg in the West, the British begin removing children and some women, but largely children, out into Gloucestershire or the Peak District or any place where a family was willing to take them. So this is a really unusual picture because you don't see any of the mothers or fathers with the children. There's this one nun who has brought them. Maybe they're orphans. I didn't see any inscription on the picture. It's from the Imperial War Museum. I didn't see any inscription that explains what she's doing there as a kind of, let's say, parental replacement figure. But the policeman is checking the tags. Now, just think for a moment. I remember how we tagged our kids. You probably did too, sending them off to kindergarten with a tag and hoping they'd arrive at the right place. think about the anguish for the families, putting these tags on their kids, sending them off to somebody they had never met in their lives, and they don't whether the person they were sending the kids to was grumpy or abusive or kind or loving or whatever. And so each of them has a tag, and these kids probably don't know one another. What he has here makes me think that maybe he is an orphan. It's just a string bag. But they're off into uncertainty, which is one of the big themes that we'll be talking about later on. A different kind of evacuation is here. People taking a risk. There are so many risks involved with refugees. These people are trying to cross the Elbe River at a 45-degree angle because the bridge has been destroyed by the retreating German army, so that the Wehrmacht, destroyed by the Wehrmacht, so that the advancing Red Army won't have such an easy time crossing the Elbe River. These people are hoping to get to the American and British lines. That's their great hope, and they're willing to take this risk in order to escape the Red Army and get to American and British lines. Nuremberg. When the war ended, I think this is St. Sebald. I think I'm pointing in the right direction because it looks as though that's the castle on the north side of the city. In any event, you can see a road going through the town here, but the rest of the town is rubble. And so the city fathers of Nuremberg had to get together and decide whether it was worth trying to save the city. The choice was to get the resources together to rebuild Nuremberg or to abandon it completely, just leave it like that. So they did decide to rebuild it, and they built a railroad through here. It was called the Rubble Express, and they loaded all that stone onto that railroad and cleared the city out so that it could be revived, renewed, reconstructed. This is a kid wailing about the ruins of his home. The reason that I show this to you is because all the family pictures in our home, it's me. That's what I looked like at age 11. Go in a different direction. French refugees heading for the border of occupied France. You know, when the Germans forced the French to surrender, they split France into an occupied zone and an unoccupied zone. If you've ever been to that beautiful garden section of France along the Loire River, that's more or less where, a little bit south of Tours, where it was split. And these people are all trying to get to unoccupied France in the south. I don't know why this column is stopped. I didn't find an explanation caption for it. But what happened with a lot of them was that they left Paris with their own personal automobiles and got so far and ran out of gas. And then the question was, where do you go from there? Can you buy a horse, or can you get a cart, or do you get on foot and walk the rest of the way to unoccupied France? I don't know whether I did that. I don't think so. The light, I mean. So there is an excellent novel about this. It's part of a two-story book by Irene Nemirovsky, which is called Suite Française, and the first novel in the duet is called Storm in June, and it describes this situation vividly and perfectly. Okay, so we're in the United States now. And do you call these people refugees? What would you call them? It's an odd situation, isn't it? They're American citizens. The military commanders on the West Coast convinced the administration in Washington to issue a presidential decree authorizing the commandant on the West Coast to take into custody anybody who might be a threat to the national interest. Anybody. Didn't say Japanese in the presidential decree, but notice what this says. There's no question about who's being taken into custody. So here they are being packed into cattle cars, into box cars, and with whatever they could take with them. If they had a business, let's say in San Francisco, they couldn't take their business with them. And when they got home from the camps in 1944 or 1945, many of them found that the businesses weren't there. The fishermen couldn't find their nets any longer. The boats were gone. So, would you call them refugees? I'll leave that up to you. Many of I'm sure, have seen Schindler's List. Have you? Some of you who are younger may not have encountered this because when it came out in the 1990s, everybody was seeing it. But nowadays, when I ask a class, about half of the class will say that they've seen it. In any event, this is Liam Neeson here. The head-on shot, which is in the Spielberg film, is actually much more dramatic than that because he's so much taller than everybody in the crowd. But he has rescued them from, it is a true story, he has rescued them from Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he's leading them. They're still, as you can see from the guards here, they're still in German-occupied territory, but he's leading them toward a factory where they can sit out, well, work through the rest of the war and anticipate a future of free people. So one more question here. What happens to those people or to any refugees once the crisis is over? Can they go home? Now you can think about Ukraine. All those people going to Poland. How many of them are never going back to Ukraine? How many of them will wind up maybe in the US or in Germany or in Poland and permanently be there? So just being saved from the moment of terror doesn't mean that they're saved from ongoing disorder in their lives. So here's an example. This is Bergen-Belsen at the moment when the British troops arrived to liberate the camp. And as you can see, a couple of people are smiling. Here's someone smiling. There's another smile. But for the most part, they look shocked and bewildered. What's going to happen to us now? Who are those guys who came in? I mean, they didn't know that the uniforms the Tommies were wearing were different from Ivan in the Red Army, what he was wearing. And so you have all these people knowing, at least for the moment, that they're not likely to die that day. But what then? Russian women. There were as many as 65 million who were displaced at one moment or another in the course of the war. By 1945, some people had drifted home. Quite a lot had died. The French historian Henri Michel says there were about 30 million refugees at that point of the end of the war in 1945. These Russian women had been taken captive as forced laborers and brought into Germany. You can tell from the clothing that they're wearing. This is prison-issued clothing with those stripes. You may have seen some of it in the previous slide. They were theoretically liberated, but they were being sent back to the Soviet Union. And this was an agreement that the Americans and British made with the Russian government at Yalta. It was confirmed subsequently that all Soviet citizens would be returned to the Soviet Union, whether they wanted to go or not. There was a terrible mess in South Austria, in the Dal Valley, where a lot of Cossack families did not want to return to the Soviet Union. And the British gave the job to some troops, inner-skilling troops from Northern Ireland, said, get them on the trains. And it was a horror show. The priests were trying to pray, the Orthodox priests were trying to pray, the women were screaming, the kids were getting trampled, and they were all put on these boxcars with nothing but a pail. And when they got back to the Soviet Union, most people who had been imprisoned in Germany were sent to the Gulag because they were contaminated by having had contact with the Nazis. The United Nations knew, when I say United Nations, I mean the Allies, because the UN formally wasn't established until 1945, but they used the term United Nations during the war. And in 1943, they established this Unra organization, UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which lasted for 2 years. And in the course of those 2 years, it oversaw displaced person camps. There were hundreds of displaced person camps in Central Europe. And it didn't cover prisoners of war, so that was a whole different situation. But this is a staggering figure. 11.5 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Many people didn't want to live under Soviet occupation, and so they were willing not to go home in order to avoid the Red Army occupation. And among the people who were liberated from the camps, there were hundreds of thousands of Jews who didn't want to stay in Germany. And they had been, sent to Poland, or most of them sent to Poland, to the government general. So they had been expelled from Germany. And many of them who tried to find their former homes would find somebody else living in them by the time they got there. And so the Zionist cause recruited them as pioneers for a new nation in Palestine. This is a camp right after the war ended. They eating from common bowls, but they look happy enough to be out of the prisons, out of the concentration camps, and into the displaced persons camps. There were about 200,000 Ukrainians who were in those camps in Germany and Austria. Some of them were exclusively Ukrainian, while some of the camps were mixed. In addition to their Christianity, whether they were Orthodox Ukrainian or Catholic Ukrainian, they had these things in common. They all hated communism. They didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. They wanted an independent Ukraine. And in order to keep their culture, you may have noticed, I've noticed this among my Ukrainian friends in the United States, they're very sensitive about retaining that traditional culture. And so in the camps, they had distinct Ukrainian schools. I asked Pat Reed if he would translate the big term here. Anybody know Hebrew? Well, Pat says the big term is, I'm trying to remember, torbuth. And he said that it means home. And so this is a Hebrew school in 1948. So this is 3 years after the war. This is the year that Israel, the state of Israel, is established. And you can be sure that much of what was taught in this school was a preparation for their being members of a new nation, because the Zionist movement was very strong in the camps. David Ben-Gurion went from camp to camp. He wasn't a displaced person. He was traveling on his own, but the first president of Israel, Ben-Gurion, went from camp to camp recruiting people to go to Israel. So a lot of them took the risk of getting on a junk like this. This is the Exodus. It was a Zionist chartered vessel that had 4,500 refugees on their way to Palestine. Never made it. You can see how many people are jammed on this old ramshackle ship, but they never make it because the British weren't interested in having thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees settling in Palestine, because the British were sensitive about their relationship with the Palestinian Arabs. And the British government had determined that its policy was to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. And so this ship was intercepted by the British Navy short of Tel Aviv, and they were all put on 3 other vessels and sent back to France. And they went back to the camps, to displaced person camps. In the years after the war, the United Nations Relief Administration was disbanded. Its work was over by 1947, but there were subsequent organizations to help the people who were still in Central Europe with no home. And so that work continued. By 1960, most of the formal treatment is not the term I want, administration to care for displaced persons was over. All the refugee camps were closed by 1960. How many came to the U.S.? Well, initially, the U.S. wasn't throwing its arms wide open, but eventually, nearly 500,000 were accepted in the United States, people who had come from the camps. Let's look eastward. Chinese had a very different situation because once the Sino-Japanese War was over, the Chinese Civil War resumed. And the war between the Kuomintang government and Mao Zedong's communist movement resumed. It had been sort of suspended. And so the people you see in this picture didn't want to be living in a newly communist China. It wasn't formally communist till 1949. But they headed into Hong Kong, and Hong Kong wasn't at all prepared to have 3 million Chinese in the colony. And it was overwhelmed, and it took a long time for them to make housing arrangements for all these people flooding in. There were mostly Jewish stateless refugees in Shanghai, and they were cared for by charitable Jewish organizations in the United States and elsewhere. And then there are all these poor guys who are going home to be considered failures. And those who don't go home go to Soviet camps. About 500,000 of them were taken as slave labor, and they weren't supervised by the United Nations or Unra or any charitable organization. About 100,000 Japanese died in the Soviet work camps. So I'm going to look very quickly through a few pictures here of I want to go one more slide back. How often the refugee crises occur. I'm talking about World War II as if it was the last big refugee crisis, but that's far from the truth. And how can people prepare for that? How do the Ukrainian people know enough to get ready to take their pets with them and their family photos and their documents and so forth? Vietnam, 1975. Geographically, Vietnam doesn't give people a very great opportunity to escape to another land because there's no convenient land bridge connecting Vietnam with Mexico or Canada or the United States. And there was, to the north was the communist state of North Vietnam, and which is going to be a united communist Vietnam right here in 1975, or communist China or communist Cambodia. And so these people took to the sea. And lots of them died at sea. You can see in this middle picture that there is a ship towing this junk. I don't mean in the sense of Chinese junk. I mean really piece of trash to carry people already in the water. It's hard to know how many people were in this category of boat people because so many of them drowned at sea. Eventually, quite a few of them got to the United States, and some of them came to Providence, and some of them have a scholarship here at PC. This is Rwanda, a situation that is so complicated that I'm not even going to try to sort it out for you. Initially, Rwanda and Burundi are up here in the lake area of Central Africa, formerly a Belgian mandate. And the population is divided between Tutsis, T-U-T-S-I, and Hutus, you can see the word here, Hutus. There's also a Twa population of pygmies in Rwanda, and they suffered pretty badly during the genocide here. But this was a genuine genocide because in 1994, the Hutus had been fleeing into Rwanda from Burundi and some from Uganda, and the Hutus initiated a horrendous genocide. In 3 months, they killed 800,000 Tutsis. Later in the year, the Tutsis gained control of Rwanda, and they expelled 2 million of the Hutus from Rwanda. To simplify the whole story, spend 2 hours watching a film called Hotel Rwanda. It's chilling. Okay, let's look at another one, getting closer to our time. Myanmar refugees, about 500,000 initially, now maybe 1 million of them. The Rohingya are Muslims who are an ethnic minority in Myanmar, which was formerly Burma, and as such, they are not officially recognized by the government of Myanmar. So they are stateless persons. I've used this term previously this afternoon, but a stateless person is somebody who has no official existence, doesn't have status in a country, doesn't have a passport, doesn't have the right to vote, doesn't have work papers, just doesn't have any official existence. And these people migrated into Bangladesh, which is poor enough on its own to begin with, and then arriving in Bangladesh, they are in ramshackle bamboo and tarpaulin structures like this, which are just blown over when the monsoon comes during the summer months. And so these poor people are really among the wretched of the earth. Syria, we don't have time to talk about at great length. 12 million people as of 2015 displaced. You've seen the pictures of them trying to get into Greece on things that look like large tube tires, or trying to get into Italy by exploitative refugee traffickers. But we finally come to our own moment in time. This could be a Modigliani sculpture. With this, does that say loneliness? When it's all over, who's going to fix this? How can he even ride his bicycle over the rubble? Waiting to be evacuated. Along here, they must be 25 deep between the train tracks and the train station building. But this picture does not convey the individual experience the way this picture does. So, now what? Will they get home? If they get home, will they get home too? Now what? That's an answer that a historian can't give you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Providence College Podcast. If you're on campus this Thursday, March 31st, the Political Science Department's Dr. Doug Blum, Dr. Casey Stevens, and Dr. Ruth Ben-Artzi will present Russia's Invasion of Ukraine and the Paradox of Global Security, the third lecture in this series. It will take place at 6:30 in the Ruane Center for the Humanities, room 105.